John Ramirez, a decorated veteran with PTSD, waits quietly at a bus stop for his VA therapy session. Mistaking him for a threat, Officer Darren Cole tases him without provocation, triggering a traumatic episode. As John convulses, a Pentagon convoy arrives, revealing his protected status via a biometric monitor. Agent Robert King confronts Cole, exposing the officer's error. Dr. Lena Hall comforts John, affirming his resilience. The incident sparks outrage, with Cole facing investigation and calls for reform. But what happens next? Will justice prevail, or will John's pain be forgotten again? Support veterans' mental health. Share your story, volunteer, or donate to local programs. Subscribe to our channel for more touching stories honoring unsung heroes. Like, comment, and spread awareness to ensure no veteran's voice goes unheard. Together we can remind them they're seen. Thank you for watching. The officer's voice cut through the crisp morning air like a blade. Move along, old man. This bench isn't yours. His hand rested on the taser at his hip, fingers twitching with the authority he wore like a second skin. John Ramirez, the man on the bench, lifted his gaze slowly. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of a worn black cap, held a quiet weight. Exhaustion carved deep into the lines of his face. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice steady but laced with a fatigue that seemed to come from his bones. "I think I've earned a seat." Those words hung in the air, raw and unyielding, but they weren't enough to stop what came next. Without hesitation, the officer fired his taser. 50,000 volts tore through John's chest, a jagged current that lit his nerves on fire. He wasn't armed, he wasn't resisting. He was just a man waiting for a bus, a man whose body had already endured more battles than most could fathom. His knees buckled, slamming against the pavement. His body convulsed, muscles seizing in unnatural spasms. No warning, no reason. 6 minutes later, the street was sealed off, not for a terrorist threat or a public crisis, but for a Pentagon convoy that rolled in with a purpose no one yet understood. What unfolded next would ripple through Albuquerque, shaking the city to its core. John Ramirez didn't carry himself like the hero he once was. At 65, he was a shadow of the Army Ranger who'd navigated treacherous mountain passes in Afghanistan, leading reconnaissance missions through nights so dark they seemed to swallow sound. He didn't wear his Bronze Star or speak of the commendations tucked away in a dusty box in his closet. Instead, he wore a faded brown leather jacket, its seams fraying like the edges of his life, and a black cap pulled low to shield his tired eyes from the world. For 15 years, John had served with a loyalty that burned fierce and unyielding, shaped by a childhood in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where duty was woven into the fabric of his being. His mother's voice still echoed in his mind. John never shied away from the hard things, and war. That was the hardest thing he ever faced. War had left its scars, some visible, most not. A mortar attack on a forward operating base in 2008 had stolen 2 of his closest brothers in arms and left John with a traumatic brain injury that fractured his sense of self. Memory lapses plagued him, moments where names, dates, or entire conversations slipped through his fingers like sand. Disorientation would creep in without warning, turning a crowded street into a maze of threats. And then there was the rage, a stranger that lived inside him now, flaring at the sound of a slammed door or the sight of a raised hand. Nightmares haunted him, striking most often between 2 and 3 in the morning. He'd wake gasping, sweat-soaked, his hands clawing for a rifle that hadn't been there in years. The silence of his small Albuquerque apartment was deafening, but his mind was a battlefield, alive with the crack of gunfire and the screams of men long gone. John's world had shrunk over the years. He lived alone in a modest downtown apartment, its walls bare except for a single photo of his old unit, faded and curling at the edges. He had no family left, no job that could tolerate the gaps in his resume or the way his eyes darted when a coworker dropped a coffee mug. The Veterans Affairs Clinic on the east side of town was his only anchor, a place where he could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in. Every Thursday at 8:30 a.m., he met Dr. Lena Hall, a trauma psychologist with a voice as calm as still water and eyes that held his gaze even when he spoke of the days he'd rather forget. Lena never rushed him, never told him to move on. She listened, and in her quiet presence, John found a fragile thread of peace. She'd helped him build a routine, wake early, drink 2 glasses of water, take his meds, and most crucially, ride the city bus. For someone with PTSD, stepping onto a crowded bus was like wading into a firefight. Every stranger a potential threat, every sudden noise a trigger. But Lena's words were a lifeline. You can't hide from the world, John. You have to move through it, one stop at a time. That Thursday morning, John stood at the Riverside Avenue bus stop, his calloused hands clutching a folder of appointment papers and a bottle of cold water that felt like his only tether to calm. The bench was icy beneath him, the wind biting at his exposed skin. But he was there, on time, focused, fighting a battle no one else could see. Sitting still on that bench was an act of courage, a quiet defiance against the chaos in his mind. To the world, he was just an old man waiting for a bus. To John, he was a soldier holding the line. Officer Darren Cole, on the other hand, saw the world through a different lens. 9 years on the Albuquerque police force had sharpened his instincts, or so he believed. He prided himself on reading people, on spotting trouble before it could spark. His morning patrols along Riverside Avenue were routine, a loop through an industrial district now dotted with crumbling storefronts and faces that seemed to belong nowhere. That morning, just after 8:10 a.m., his cruiser slowed as he spotted John on the bench. The old man sat slouched, his jacket worn thin, his cap casting shadows over his face. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, just sitting, unnervingly still. To Cole, that stillness was a red flag. His mind raced through possibilities. Intoxication, mental instability, or worse, a hidden threat. Years of patrolling had taught him to trust his gut, and his gut screamed that this man didn't belong here. Cole's hand rested on his taser as he approached, his posture rigid with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his own judgment. He didn't see a veteran, didn't see a man grappling with invisible wounds. He saw a problem to be solved, a variable to be controlled. John's quiet dignity, his steady voice claiming his right to sit, didn't register as strength. It registered as defiance. And defiance, in Cole's world, was a spark that needed to be snuffed out. The taser's crackle was the sound of that moment breaking, a sound that would echo far beyond that cold bench on Riverside Avenue. As John's body hit the ground, the pain was more than physical. It was the betrayal of a country he'd bled for, a country that now saw him as a nuisance, a vagrant, a threat. His heart pounded, not just from the voltage, but from the weight of a life reduced to this moment, alone, humiliated, discarded. Yet even as his vision blurred, a flicker of resilience burned in him, the same fire that had carried him through war zones and nightmares. He wasn't done fighting, not yet. And the city, it was about to learn the case of forgetting a man like John Ramirez. The air hung heavy with the weight of routine suspicion as Officer Cole pulled his cruiser to the curb. His eyes locked onto the man sitting alone on the bench, an instinct honed by years of patrolling kicking in. This guy, disheveled, still too still, set off alarms in Cole's mind. He wasn't the kind of person you called to help. He was the kind you called about. The type who made shopkeepers clutch their phones and pedestrians quicken their pace. Cole's hand instinctively rested on the cool grip of his taser as he stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. "Move along, old man," he barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the hum of the city. "This isn't your bench." John Ramirez lifted his gaze, his dark eyes meeting Cole's with a quiet steadiness that masked the storm brewing beneath. Confusion flickered across his weathered face, but his voice remained even, worn thin by years of carrying burdens no one could see. "I'm just waiting for the bus," he said, each word deliberate, as if he'd rehearsed it to keep the tremor in his chest at bay. "Got a VA appointment in 20 minutes. His hands rested on a worn folder in his lap, its edges frayed from constant handling. Inside were his medical records, his VA identification, and the therapy notes he clung to like a lifeline, a roadmap for navigating a world that felt increasingly foreign. But Cole wasn't listening. He didn't hear the careful cadence of John's breathing, the disciplined rhythm of a man fighting to stay grounded. He didn't notice the faint shake in John's fingers, the way they tightened around the folder as if it could anchor him against the rising tide of anxiety. To Cole, John was just another figure out of place, a potential threat in a city that demanded vigilance. Cole's voice hardened, his patience already fraying. "Stand up, show me your ID." He stepped closer, his posture rigid, his hand still hovering near the taser. John didn't rush. His therapist's words echoed in his mind. Move slowly in public. Sudden movements scare people. He'd learned this the hard way, after too many startled glances and tense encounters. Keeping his eyes on Cole, he reached carefully for his back pocket, still seated, hoping to avoid escalation. He just wanted to hand over his ID to prove he was no one to fear. But Cole's voice surged, sharp and commanding. "I said, stand up. Hands where I can see them." John froze, his mind snagging on the contradiction. Stand, but don't move your hands. The words tangled in his head, a puzzle with no solution. To John, whose instincts had been forged in the chaos of combat, it felt like a trap. His training kicked in. Pause, assess, recalculate. But that hesitation, that split second of stillness, was all Cole needed. The officer's eyes narrowed, his fear reading defiance where there was none. Without another word, Cole raised the taser and fired. The probe struck John square in the chest, and 50,000 volts tore through him like lightning. His body seized, muscles locking in a brutal, involuntary spasm. He collapsed to the sidewalk, his knees slamming into the concrete with a sickening crack. His arms flailed, nerves screaming in a chaotic symphony of pain and confusion. The folder slipped from his grasp, its contents scattering across the pavement. His VA card, his therapy notes, his proof of who he was, all ignored in the heat of the moment. A raw cry tore from his throat, not just from the physical agony, but from the crushing weight of helplessness. This was worse than war. In combat, at least he knew who the enemy was, where the danger lay. Here on a city street, surrounded by the familiar, the betrayal cut deeper. Pedestrians paused, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. Some pulled out their phones, capturing the scene in cold, detached frames. Others just stared, their silence louder than any protest. No one stepped forward. Cole loomed over John, his voice booming. "Stop resisting!" But John couldn't resist. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely draw a ragged breath. His body was a prisoner to the electricity's aftershocks, his mind a battlefield of its own. For veterans like John, the wounds that don't bleed are the hardest to bear. PTSD doesn't wear a cast or leave a visible scar. A traumatic brain injury doesn't announce itself with a limp or a bandage. They lurk, silent and insidious, until a shouted command, a sudden spark of fear, detonates the fragile calm within. John wasn't defiant, he wasn't dangerous. He was following the rules his therapist had drilled into him. Stay calm, stick to the routine, take the bus to the VA, keep breathing through the stress. He was a soldier following orders, clinging to the discipline that had kept him alive through war. Yet here he was, treated as a threat, his silence misread as suspicion, his control mistaken for rebellion. To Officer Cole, John wasn't a veteran with a story, a man with a purpose. He was a problem to be neutralized. As the taser's current faded, John's body hit the pavement again with a dull, sickening thud. His head snapped sideways, his jaw clenched so tightly he tasted blood, the metallic tang of his bitten tongue flooding his mouth. His limbs jerked, unresponsive to his will, as his chest heaved in short, panicked bursts. To the onlookers, it looked like a man resisting arrest, a spectacle to be recorded or ignored. But inside John's mind, the world had unraveled. Riverside Avenue was gone. The city sounds faded, replaced by the deafening ring of a mortar blast. He was back in Afghanistan, sprawled on the scorching earth, dust choking his lungs, the acrid smell of blood and smoke filling his senses. Sergeant Cruz lay beside him, motionless, his lifeless eyes staring into the void. John's body convulsed, his arms clawing at the ground, desperate to crawl away, to escape the explosion that lived on in his memory. His legs refused to obey, just as they had back then, pinned under the weight of trauma that never truly left. This wasn't war, but it felt the same. The shouts, the chaos, the helplessness, it was all too familiar. Only this time it wasn't a battlefield. It was home, a place that was supposed to be safe. And yet, as John's vision blurred and his heart pounded, he was trapped in a war that never ended. triggered not by gunfire but by the fear and misunderstanding of a man who saw only a threat, not a survivor. The terror gripped John Ramirez with the same ferocity it always had, a suffocating vice that crushed his chest and fractured his thoughts. Around him, the city sidewalk pulsed with life, but it felt like a stage where he was the unwilling centerpiece. Passers-by slowed their steps, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Hands reached for phones, fingers swiping to capture the scene unfolding before them. Across the street, a young man in a hoodie hit record, his expression torn between fascination and discomfort. A woman nearby, clutching a steaming coffee cup, shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is he on something?" she murmured to no one in particular. Another bystander, an older woman with kind but wary eyes, leaned toward her companion. "No, I've seen him before," she said softly. "I think he's a veteran." Her words carried a flicker of recognition, but no action followed. No one stepped forward. No one knelt to offer comfort or extended a hand to steady him. Fear, raw and instinctive, drowned out any impulse to help, leaving John alone in his spiraling panic. Officer Darren Cole loomed over John, his taser still drawn, its weight heavy in his grip. His breaths came in short, sharp bursts, adrenaline coursing through him as he spoke into his radio with clip-bit precision. "Subject is non-compliant," he reported, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Possibly under the influence. Non-lethal force deployed." The words were procedural, detached, but they omitted the truth of what had come before. He didn't mention that John had been sitting quietly on the sidewalk, his gaze distant but harmless, before the officer's approach. He didn't note the worn VA folder now splayed open on the pavement, its pages fluttering in the breeze like fragile, forgotten promises. Nor did he acknowledge the raw panic in John's eyes, not anger, not defiance, but a desperate, pleading confusion as if the world had shattered around him without warning. John's voice trembled as he tried to speak, the words fracturing before they could form. I'm not." His hands fumbled, reaching toward his chest, toward the scattered folder, toward anything that might anchor him to reality. To Officer Cole, though, every movement looked like defiance, a threat brewing in slow motion. "Stay down," Cole barked, his voice sharp and commanding as he stepped closer, his boots heavy on the concrete. The order only tightened the knot in John's chest. His breathing quickened, spiraling into shallow, frantic gasps. His lungs felt like they were collapsing, refusing to draw in enough air. His heart thundered, each beat so violent it seemed his chest might split open. This wasn't just panic, it was something deeper, more primal. John was dissociating, his mind retreating from the unbearable present, seeking refuge in the fragments of itself. The city's sounds, blaring horns, hurried footsteps, hushed voices, blurred into a single piercing hum, a white noise that swallowed everything else. On that cold sidewalk, John Ramirez was unraveling, caught in the grip of a full-blown PTSD episode. This was the moment his therapist, Dr. Lena Hall, had warned him about, the precipice where stability could crumble under the weight of misunderstanding. She had spoken of the delicate balance veterans like John navigated, carrying invisible scars from years of combat, scars that could tear open at the slightest misstep by those around them. John had tried to prepare for moments like this, but no amount of therapy could shield him from the chaos now consuming him. The crowd watched, their faces a mosaic of pity, fear, and detachment. Officer Cole, meanwhile, gripped his radio again, his voice firm as he called for backup. "Subject is unstable, appears dangerous," he said, his words cementing a narrative that couldn't have been further from the truth. Awaiting assistance. No one saw John for who he was, a wounded soldier, fighting to survive one agonizing breath at a time. No one recognized the war still raging inside him, a battle he'd thought he'd left behind on distant battlefields. His body betrayed him, his limbs twitching in uncoordinated spasms, his breath so shallow they barely sustained him. His heart rate soared to dangerous heights, far beyond what any healthy body could endure. But there was something else, something no one on that sidewalk could have known. Sewn into the lining of John's jacket near his collarbone was a small black disc, no larger than a quarter. It was a government-issued biometric monitor, assigned only to high-risk veterans under specialized federal oversight. John's file was marked as Tier 1, combat exposure, multiple concussions, PTSD with severe dissociation risk. The moment his pulse spiked past 180 and his neurological signals grew erratic, the device sprang to life, sending a secure satellite ping to 2 destinations. His VA caseworker in a classified medical liaison program run by the Department of Defense. 4 minutes after the taser's jolt coursed through John's body, the first black SUV appeared, its sleek form cutting through the city's rhythm. Bystanders glanced up, assuming it was another police unit. Then a second SUV pulled in, followed by a third. No sirens pierced the air, no lights flashed, just silent, deliberate momentum and tinted windows that revealed nothing. The vehicles moved with tactical precision, one halting at the curb, another flanking the crosswalk, and the third claiming the center of the intersection. It was a coordinated maneuver, almost military in its execution. When the doors swung open, 6 figures in charcoal gray suits stepped out, their movements synchronized, purposeful. These weren't local police. They wore no badges, displayed no hesitation. Leading them was a man whose presence alone commanded the scene. Agent Robert King was tall, broad-shouldered, his face carved with calm resolve. He carried no visible weapon, but his authority silenced the crowd faster than any shout or siren could have. In his right hand, he held nothing but a quiet confidence, a signal that whatever was happening now was no longer in anyone else's control. In the fading light of a New Mexico afternoon, Special Agent Robert King strode toward the chaotic scene with a presence that commanded attention. In his right hand, he clutched a sleek leather folder, its gold trim catching the sun's last rays, a subtle signal of authority. In his left, he held a slim ID case, its surface embossed with the unmistakable seal of the Pentagon's Office of Protective Affairs. His steps were deliberate, his expression unyielding, as if he carried the weight of a mission that transcended the ordinary. The air around him seemed to tighten as he approached Officer Cole, who stood rigid, still reeling from the incident that had unfolded moments before. "Are you the responding officer?" King's voice was low, measured, each word precise, like the ticking of a metronome. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried an undercurrent of authority that made Cole's pulse quicken. The officer blinked, his mind scrambling to catch up. "Yes, I had to subdue him. He wasn't complying, and I thought..." His words stumbled, his confusion palpable as he tried to piece together the whirlwind of the last few minutes. "Wait, who are you?" King didn't hesitate. He raised the ID badge to eye level, its credentials gleaming under the streetlights. "Special Agent Robert King, Department of Defense," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're standing over Master Sergeant John Anthony Ramirez, U.S. Army Rangers retired, highly decorated, medically classified. You just tased a federally monitored combat veteran under DOD protection, and you did it without provocation." Each sentence landed like a hammer, deliberate and heavy, stripping away any illusion of control Officer Cole might have clung to. The color drained from Cole's face, his skin paling to a ghostly white as the gravity of his actions sank in. His mind raced, replaying the moment he'd seen Ramirez, disoriented, unresponsive, his movements erratic. To Cole, it had looked like a threat, like someone under the influence, a danger to the public. "I thought he was on something," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't following orders. King's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing through Cole's excuses. "He's under psychiatric care for wartime trauma," he said, his tone sharp but controlled, as if he were restraining a deeper anger. "His biometrics triggered an emergency alert. You're not authorized to engage someone in his category without federal coordination. That protocol is now active. Step aside. Now." The words weren't a request, they were a command. Cole's hands trembled as he stepped back, his taser still clipped to his belt, now feeling like a lead weight pulling him into a nightmare. The street, moments ago a chaotic blur of shouts and tension, fell into a heavy silence. The crowd, which had gathered in a semicircle, their phones raised to capture the scene, now murmured in confusion. A woman clutching a coffee cup, her eyes wide with shock, whispered to her friend, Wait, he's military. The name hung in the air, a quiet revelation that shifted the narrative from threat to tragedy. King's team moved with surgical precision. Two agents dressed in unassuming dark jackets began documenting the scene. One snapped photos, the camera's shutter clicking like a metronome, capturing every angle of the spilled leather folder, its contents scattered across the pavement. The other scanned the documents with a handheld device, its screen glowing faintly as it cataloged classified information. They marked the spot where the taser's prongs had struck, their movements methodical, as if they were piecing together a puzzle only they could fully understand. Beside Ramirez, a third agent knelt, his demeanor calm but focused. He wasn't just a medic. He was trained for combat trauma, his hands steady as he spoke in soft, practiced tones. "Sergeant Ramirez," he said, his voice a lifeline cutting through the fog of John's fractured mind. "You're safe now. You're okay. We've got you." John's chest heaved, his muscles still twitching from the taser's aftershock. But the familiar cadence of the medic's voice began to anchor him. His eyes, wild and unfocused moments ago, flickered with recognition. The medic's presence was a tether, pulling him back from the abyss of memory. Flashes of gunfire, sand, and screams that had haunted him since Afghanistan. Another agent approached Officer Cole, his movements swift and unapologetic. Without a word, he retrieved the body cam footage from Cole's uniform, his fingers deftly navigating the device. Cole opened his mouth to protest, but King's cold stare silenced him. "No one told me," Cole said, his voice cracking, desperation creeping in. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," King replied, his tone icy, each word laced with the weight of consequence. "You made assumptions. You escalated. And now you're under federal review." The power dynamic had shifted so completely that Cole felt the ground beneath him dissolve. The man he'd seen as a threat, the one he'd tased without hesitation, was now a protected asset, a hero under the Pentagon's watchful eye. And Cole, who moments ago had held the authority of the badge, now stood in the spotlight of accountability, the weight of federal oversight pressing down on him. As the crowd watched in stunned silence, King's team operated with quiet urgency. The two field medics, dressed not in military fatigues, but in plain dark jackets, worked with calm efficiency beside John Ramirez. They didn't shout or rush. Their movements were deliberate, honed by years of training for moments like this. One medic placed a gloved hand on John's shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "Sergeant Ramirez," he said softly, "we're with you. You're safe. You're not in Afghanistan. You're in New Mexico." Deep breaths. The words were a lifeline, grounding John as his mind teetered on the edge of chaos. His chest still heaved, his body still trembled from the taser's lingering effects, but his eyes began to focus, locking onto the medic's steady gaze. The second medic checked John's pulse, his fingers pressing lightly against his wrist, while a small biometric device on John's arm blinked faintly, transmitting data to the Pentagon's secure servers. They monitored his oxygen levels, their equipment humming softly in the background. One administered a small dose of an anti-anxiety medication, pre-approved by the VA, while the other narrated every step in a soothing voice, ensuring John wasn't startled. "We're just checking your vitals, Sergeant. You're doing great. Just keep breathing with me." Within minutes, the panic attack began to ebb. John's breathing steadied, his hands stopped trembling, and his voice, cracked and hoarse, broke through the haze. "I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered, his words heavy with exhaustion and fear. "No, Sergeant," the medic assured him, his voice warm but firm. "You didn't." Across town at the VA Medical Center, Dr. Lena Hall sat at her desk, her eyes scanning a patient file when her secure alert system flashed a bright red icon. "Critical. Ramirez, J." Her stomach plummeted, a cold wave of dread washing over her. She knew John's history, his years in the Rangers, the trauma that lingered like a shadow, the biometric device that monitored his vitals. She grabbed her keys and coat, her movements swift but controlled, and dialed the emergency hotline tied to the Pentagon's liaison team. "This is Dr. Lena Hall, VA Behavioral Services," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency coursing through her. "I'm en route to Riverside in 7th. Tell Agent King I'm coming." 20 minutes later, she arrived at the scene, her heart pounding as she took in the tableau. John, wrapped in a thermal blanket, sitting on the tailgate of a Pentagon SUV, his face pale but calmer now. The medics stood nearby, their presence a quiet reassurance. Lena's eyes met John's, and she saw the flicker of recognition, the faint spark of trust that had been built over months of therapy. She knelt beside him, her voice soft but steady. "John, it's me, Dr. Hall. You're okay. We're going to take care of you." Her words were a promise, a vow to guide him back from the edge, just as she had done so many times before. As the medics continued their work, and King handled the legal fallout with Officer Cole, the street remained a frozen tableau of tension and revelation. The crowd, once buzzing with fear and judgment, now stood in quiet awe, their whispers carrying fragments of John's story, a hero, a veteran, a man caught in the crossfire of his own mind. And in that moment, as the Pentagon's team moved with quiet precision, John Ramirez was no longer just a man on the ground. He was a soldier, a survivor, and a reminder of the unseen battles that lingered long after the war was over. Dr. Lena Hall knelt beside John Ramirez, her hands steady as she monitored his vitals, the city's hum fading into the background. His eyes, shadowed by fear and relief, sparked with recognition when they met hers. "Doc," he whispered, his voice raw with unspoken pain. Lena's heart tightened. She saw the war raging in his gaze, the weight of battles fought and a life struggling to find peace. "John, you did everything right," she said softly, her words a lifeline. "You followed the plan, kept your routine. This wasn't your fault." Her voice was a quiet anchor, pulling him back from the edge. John's lips quivered, emotion choking his words. "I was just waiting for the bus," he said, the simplicity of his truth cutting deep. Lena felt the sting of injustice, the quiet dignity of a man who had served so much, reduced to this moment. "I know," she murmured, her thumb brushing his knuckles, grounding him. "And the system worked. It brought us to you." Standing, she turned to the federal agents, their black SUVs a stark contrast to the ordinary street. "Thank you for getting here so fast," she said, gratitude masking her simmering anger. Agent Robert King nodded, his face carved with resolve. His heart rate spiked, and his device pinged our grid. We were less than 5 miles out. Lena glanced at the growing crowd, their faces curious but unaware. "They don't realize it yet," she said, "but you likely saved his life today. Again." King's jaw tightened. "He's not the first," he said, "and he won't be the last." The biometric alert system, a VA and Defense Department innovation, had saved over 80 veterans. Its discrete devices, embedded in jackets, watches, or med kits, triggering encrypted alerts to response teams for warriors who had given everything. Lena looked back at John, her heart heavy. "You didn't just survive today, John," she said. "You proved this system works, that you're worth protecting." John nodded, his shoulders easing, shame flickering in his eyes. "Didn't feel like that at first," he admitted. Lena's smile was warm, fierce. "Too many don't see what we see," she said, "but your country hasn't forgotten you." Medics guided John to the SUV, a private VA room waiting. The crowd dispersed, but the moment lingered. John wasn't just a name or a shadow, he was a soldier, wounded but not abandoned. Help had come, wearing the right uniform. As the last Pentagon vehicle left Riverside Avenue, the city buzzed. Social media erupted with videos of John writhing on the pavement, taser wires attached, an officer looming as SUVs arrived. This was no fiction. It was real. Officer Darren Cole was placed on leave within hours, his body cam footage seized, revealing a calm John following contradictory commands. The taser was fired in frustration, not fear, no weapon, no threat. Cole's claim of erratic behavior collapsed. Toxicology was clean, and John's VA paperwork marked him as a decorated veteran with severe PTSD, flagged as "do not engage with force." The Pentagon's press conference was clear. "Master Sergeant Ramirez served for 15 years, Agent King said beside Dr. Hall. "He saved lives abroad, and yesterday he nearly lost his own at home." On a quiet afternoon, John Ramirez sat alone on a city bench, his gaze fixed on some distant point no one else could see. The world around him buzzed with the hum of urban life, cars honking, pedestrians chatting. But John was elsewhere, lost in the echo of memories that refused to fade. His hands, rough from years of gripping rifles and navigating hostile terrains, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of invisible scars. He wasn't a threat, just a man carrying the remnants of wars fought far from home. Yet in a fleeting moment, Officer Darren Cole saw something else, a potential danger, a problem to neutralize. That misjudgment, born of haste and a lack of understanding, would ripple far beyond that bench, shaking lives, systems, and a nation's conscience. The encounter left John shaken, his heart pounding not just from the confrontation, but from the humiliation of being misunderstood. He'd served his country with unwavering loyalty, endured horrors most couldn't fathom, and now, in the place he called home, he was reduced to a suspect. The sting of that moment lingered, a bitter reminder of how his sacrifices were so easily overlooked. For Officer Cole, the aftermath was a storm of doubt and regret. He hadn't set out to harm anyone, but his training, geared toward control and quick decisions, had failed to equip him for a man like John. As he replayed the incident, Cole's confidence in his instincts wavered, replaced by a gnawing realization that his actions had wounded someone already carrying too many wounds. The fallout reached far beyond the two men. Across the city, outrage simmered. Veterans groups gathered outside City Hall, their signs a silent cry for recognition. Invisible wounds still bleed, and PTSD is not a crime. Their voices, heavy with shared pain, demanded change. Dr. Emily Hall, a psychologist who had dedicated her career to veterans' mental health, stood before the city council, her words sharp and unflinching. She spoke of the countless veterans misjudged, detained, or worse during mental health crises, men and women whose trauma was mistaken for threat. Her testimony painted a stark picture, a system that sent soldiers to war but failed to prepare the home front for their return. Each statistic she shared felt like a plea, not just for reform, but for a reckoning. The Department of Defense, stirred by the incident, didn't stop at words. Within weeks, the Pentagon sent a formal proposal to Congress, a bold call for systemic change dubbed the Ramirez Protocol. It demanded mandatory PTSD training for every law enforcement agency receiving federal funds, ensuring officers could recognize trauma signs. It proposed biometric scanners in police vehicles to instantly verify veterans' statuses in the DoD VA database, preventing future missteps. It envisioned rapid response mental health crisis units in major cities, modeled after the team that had once saved John from a darker fate. And it insisted on strict penalties for violating protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act when handling verified PTSD cases. The protocol wasn't just policy, it was a promise to honor the unseen burdens veterans carried. For Officer Cole, the consequences were personal and unrelenting. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division launched an investigation probing whether his actions amounted to excessive force or discrimination against a disabled veteran. As the legal process loomed, Cole grappled with a new reality. The job he'd once approached with certainty now placed him under scrutiny. He wondered if he'd ever regain the trust he'd lost, not just from others, but from himself. The weight of being judged mirrored the pain he'd unknowingly inflicted on John, a bitter irony that kept him awake at night. John, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't sought. His pain, once private, had ignited a national conversation. Strangers rallied for him, policymakers invoked his name, and his story became a mirror reflecting a truth many had ignored. America's veterans were too often met with suspicion rather than support. The attention was overwhelming, yet it stirred something within him, a quiet empowerment. His suffering hadn't been in vain. It had exposed a fracture in the system, and for once the system was listening. Still, the healing was slow. Each night as he tried to sleep, the memories of war mingled with the memory of that bench, a reminder of how fragile his place in the world felt. The numbers told a grim story. A 2022 VA report revealed that over 30% of post-9/11 veterans lived with PTSD symptoms, their lives shaped by the trauma that didn't end when the battles did. Yet fewer than 25% of U.S. police departments required crisis intervention training tailored to veterans' unique needs. That gap wasn't just a policy oversight, it was a betrayal of those who'd given so much. John's experience was no anomaly. It was a symptom of a deeper failure, one rooted in a culture that valued authority over empathy, compliance over compassion. Officer Cole hadn't woken up intending to harm a veteran, but he'd been shaped by a system that prioritized control over curiosity, action over understanding. In that space between misperception and reaction, veterans like John slipped through the cracks, some never finding their way back. The misunderstanding extended beyond law enforcement. Employers mistook veterans' quiet demeanor for disinterest. Landlords saw their vigilance as paranoia, and neighbors misread their solitude as instability. A man who flinched at loud noises or scanned crowds for threats wasn't unhinged. He was someone trained to survive in a world where danger was constant. Yet the same nation that built billion-dollar war machines hadn't constructed a reliable bridge to help its warriors navigate civilian life. John's case laid bare the fragility of that trust and the power of those who dared to demand better. The Pentagon's response was a step, but it raised a haunting question. Why did it take federal intervention to recognize a veteran's worth? Why weren't communities equipped to see past the surface, to understand that a man like John carried not just scars, but silent medals of courage? The story of John Ramirez is a call to see with better eyes, eyes that recognize the weight of invisible wounds, the strength it takes to carry them, and the duty we all share to build a world where veterans are met with understanding, not judgment. It's a reminder that justice, long delayed for so many, can still find its voice, but only if we listen. John Ramirez sat in the back seat of the black SUV, a thin blanket draped over his shoulders, its weight both a comfort and a reminder of the chaos he'd just endured. His body throbbed, not just from the sharp jolt of the taser that had brought him to his knees, but from the deeper ache that had settled into his bones long ago. It was the kind of pain that came from carrying memories too heavy for one man to bear. The crack of gunfire in distant deserts, the faces of friends who never made it home, and the gnawing sense of being unseen in a country he had once risked everything to protect. As he leaned his head against the cool window, watching the city streets blur into streaks of light and shadow, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt the faint pulse of hope, not loud or triumphant, but quiet, like a whisper he hadn't dared to trust until now. Someone had seen him, not the passers-by who hurried past him at the bus stop, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the scenery. Not the officer who'd mistaken his silence for a threat, his hand quick to reach for a weapon, but the people who had come for him, the ones who'd remembered who he was, even when the world had forgotten. The Pentagon agents hadn't made a show of their arrival. There were no salutes, no grand declarations of his heroism. They didn't need to say the words. Their presence spoke louder than any medal ever could. They had shown up. And for a man who'd once walked point through Taliban territory, scanning every shadow for danger, that meant more than any ceremony. In the military, you learn a truth that binds you to those who serve alongside you. You never leave a brother behind. That promise doesn't dissolve when you sign your discharge papers or hang up your uniform. It lingers, woven into the quiet moments, the unspoken signals, the voice crackling over a radio saying, "We've got your six." Today, that bond had reached across time and distance to pull John out of the darkness. His hands rested in his lap, scarred and calloused from years of gripping rifles and clinging to survival. They trembled slightly now, not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd been through, not just today, but every day since he'd come home. He thought about the countless times he'd felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that had moved on without him. The bus rides to therapy, clutching a VA folder like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. The nights spent staring at the ceiling, trying to outrun memories that refused to stay buried. The moments in line at the pharmacy, where he'd catch a stranger's glance and wonder if they saw a man or just a problem to be avoided. He'd learned to live with the weight of being invisible, of managing symptoms with names the average person couldn't pronounce, let alone understand. But today had shifted something inside him. Today, he wasn't alone. The SUV turned onto a quiet side street, and sunlight spilled through the window, catching on a small American flag pin fastened to the vehicle's interior. It glinted briefly, a tiny spark that seemed to hold a world of meaning. John's eyes lingered on it, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and sorrow. He wondered who'd left it there. Another veteran maybe, or one of the agents who'd driven through their own lives to be here for him. The city outside wasn't his enemy, though it had felt that way at times. The people rushing past weren't enemies either, but they didn't always see him. They didn't know the battles he'd fought, the ones he was still fighting every day. Sometimes it took something as jarring as today's misunderstanding. A taser, a crisis, a moment of desperation, to jolt the world into remembering what some of its people carried. John raised a hand slowly, pressing his palm against the window pane, not out of habit, but as a quiet acknowledgement of his own resilience. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Would Officer Cole, the man who'd tasered him, face consequences for his actions? Would the new laws being discussed in some far-off government office actually make a difference for veterans like him? Would his next bus ride to therapy feel safer, or would it carry the same undercurrent of uncertainty? He didn't have answers, but what he did know was this. Somewhere in a secure room filled with screens and files, someone had recognized his pain. Somewhere in the seats beside him, men he'd never met had answered a call to help. And somewhere deep within him, the belief that brotherhood didn't end when the war did had stirred awake, fragile but unbroken. He closed his eyes, sinking back into the seat, and exhaled a breath he'd been holding for years. It wasn't just a release, it was a surrender to the truth that he was still here, still fighting, and that someone had come for him. The relief of it that was overwhelming, a quiet tide that washed over him and left him somewhere softer, somewhere he could rest, if only for a moment. But even as John felt this flicker of peace, a heavier truth pressed against his heart. He was lucky. He'd survived today because someone had listened, because someone had seen him. The but signs. How many others hadn't been so fortunate? How many thousands of veterans walk these streets every day, carrying scars that didn't bleed and battling memories that never let them go? They moved through the world without fanfare, without recognition, fighting quiet wars that most people would never notice. Some were just trying to make it to their next appointment, their VA folders worn thin from use. Others were trying to sleep through the night without waking in a panic, their eyes wide, their hearts racing. And some were just waiting, hoping anyone would see the strength it took to keep going. John's story wasn't just about what had happened to him today. It was the story of every veteran who'd ever felt forgotten, whose voice had been silenced by a world that didn't always know how to listen. It was about the courage it took to live with wounds that no it didn't show, the endurance to keep showing up, and the loyalty to a brotherhood that lived on, even when the world turned away. For every John Ramirez who found a lifeline, there were countless others still out there, their battles unseen, their stories untold. As the SUV rolled on, John opened his eyes again, his gaze settling on the road ahead. The city was still there, sprawling and indifferent, but it didn't feel as heavy now. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wasn't alone. Someone had come for him, and that was enough to keep the spark of hope alive. Somewhere out there, others were waiting for their own moments of rescue, their own quiet reminders that they too were still seen. And maybe, just maybe, his story could be a signal, a voice on the radio, a world saying to them, "We've got your six."